This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L. W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
Okay, we've kind of covered, again, this is sort of the third phase of the course. I can't believe we're already there, but we are. So the first phase was trying to look at sort of how do we think about environmental problems in general, and thinking about the different perspectives. We went through a period of kind of looking at the policy process, looking about how we identify problems, how we negotiate solutions, then how we implement them and evaluate effectiveness. So we did that much too briefly, but there you have it. And now I want to go kind of, here's the part that most of you probably came for, which is sort of more of the substance part, the sort of, what are the issues, the big issues on the international environmental agenda. And certainly one of them that was big, a couple more years from now, I don't know if I'll be doing this as part of the class, but it certainly during the 90s was a very big issue. It may or may not remain a big issue from a theoretical perspective. It's likely to become a bigger issue from an empirical perspective, is this questions of environment and security. Okay, the question of what's the relationship between environment and security. And partly it's important to kind of look at this historically, to look at where this comes from historically. So why we have this, this whole sort of little cottage industry in the early 1990s. Where there's several articles that are called Redefining Security. Where does that come from? Why historically? Why would you expect that to happen? What's happening?
The end of the Cold War.
Okay, so what is that? So it's the end of the Cold War, and so what? So first of all, this is an American phenomena, right? On average, right? And so it's the end of the Cold War. So why do we expect a redefinition of security? And who's redefining it?
Probably American policymakers, I think, just because you're getting rid of the traditional us versus them mentality and realizing that there are other factors besides the Soviets that are a threat to our national security. You don't have sort of the one big enemy to fight against.
Okay, so are these, make rash generalizations, are these people we like, the people who are pushing this agenda? Do we like this agenda? Are these, who's pushing, who are the people? Not you don't have to name names, but sort of the types of people, the groups, what organizations are being represented, or what interests are being represented by those pushing a redefining security agenda?
Environmentalist groups.
Okay, so environmentalist groups.
Wouldn't it be a lot of businesses as well, though? Business and
Sorry?
government, mainly?
Okay, business and government. Why business and government? Okay.
They're the ones interested in the resources that are going to be sort of divvied up and how they get.
What resources?
Well, if you or oil, or how the relationships that were working before, they're going to completely change. So you want to make sure that you still have as big a piece of the pie as you did before.
Okay, but how does that relate to? I'm missing the connection to security then.
Well, because it becomes a security issue of what. Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not making a very good connection.
Okay, that's all right. That's all right.
Well, I see what Carr is saying, maybe the uses for nuclear weapon material, like uranium or something like that. Somebody else could use that like a power plant.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, like divvy up the resources, like they used to go to big weapons that they might not need be as big anymore.
Okay, so we got a $300 billion a year defense budget out there, right? That all of a sudden doesn't have a purpose, right? So who wants a piece of that? Risa.
I was just going to say that the defense budget, like military spending, it's all going to change, and whether they're going to allocate it to, nuclear research and development, so the nuclear power plant owners are going to be interested in things like that, or whether they're going to allocate it to something else.
Okay. So and so is it only people outside the Pentagon that care about this? Why might the people inside the Pentagon like this research agenda? And in fact, pay Tad, Homer Dixon, to do it?
For the excuse for high military spending, you say, well, the Cold War is over, Soviets aren't the enemy anymore, but we have these new threats, like environmental threats that could threaten our security, and we have to meet those threats with military spending.
Okay, great. So I mean, so one of the important issues is this notion of that we have a big defense budget, which just all of a sudden lost its purpose in life, right? Just all of a sudden lost its raison d'etre. And so what you have to do is you now have both people outside who say we want to, if this thing doesn't die, we want to be on that boat, right? That here's a set of resources that if we could recommit to environment. So environmentalists look at the defense budget and say, if we can, where is the most powerful actor in the United States government? DOD, Defense Department. If we can get their resources applied to our problem, we like that option, right? That's from the environmentalist point of view. And from the Defense Department's point of view, they say, we got these resources, and what do bureaucracies like to do? What's the main goal of a bureaucracy?
Keep existing.
Keep existing, and if possible, grow, right? And so they say, hey, here's a great way to keep our budget line at the same level. We just say that really what we need these, big satellite things so we can protect the Earth from excessive solar radiation because we've got too much global warming going on, or whatever, right? Figure out new ways to use the technologies that we've been traditionally using them and apply them to environmental technology, right? So that's sort of this strange bedfellows part of what happens in this environment and security thing, and where it kind of comes from, how you see this research agenda developing. So what is Tad Homer Dixon, Thomas Homer Dixon, but he goes by Tad. What's his argument look like? And I want to kind of lay it out, and then see how many of you are convinced. Okay, so here, this wasn't in the readings you have, but it's in one of his other articles. So, sort of help me work through the logic here. What's the logic of the argument? Overall, just get started. This is an easy one. It was just, what's in general he arguing about environment and security? Forget this. What's he arguing? Don't get confused by the facts. What is Homer Dixon arguing?
Lack of resources or scarcity will lead to conflict.
Okay, but there's a relationship between the amount of resources and conflict. What's the kind of, I don't know, so what, just for starters, what's your reaction to that argument? That environmental problems cause war. That's the short form, right? Sarah?
Well, my first reaction is, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Because if you have a shortage of something, then everyone's going to be fighting for it.
Okay. So it makes sense. Okay. Other reactions? If you think about war and environment together, what's the other possible thing that comes to mind? So environmental problems cause war. Makes sense. What else might you be concerned about?
Increases environmental problems.
Yeah, it might work the other way, huh? Like, so for example, take this list that I gave you a link to, of the world's water, this water conflict chronology. So you have something in 1503, something in 1642, 1863, use of water. What would that be? 1863? United States, right, Civil War. Okay, looks like actually General U.S. Grant cuts the levees in the battle against the Confederates. That looks more like war causing an environmental problem than the other way around here, right? Okay, and you keep going, and in almost all these cases, it looks like the major problem here, at least with respect to water, this is only with respect to water, is not one of environment causing security problems, but security causing environment problems. That, you know, you have 1938, 1940 through 45, 1943, 44, 44, da, 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 right? Okay. So in a lot of these cases, it looks like the use of water as a way to harm the environment, or the use of water as a way to, it's just another tool in military, in war. And so that in fact, you know, the problem, or take, you know, the one that you are most, well, hopefully most of you are aware of, was during the Gulf War. What happened? What was the use of the environment as a tool of war? What did Saddam Hussein do?
Burn the oil wells.
Burn the oil wells, but also just open the taps, right? Just let oil flood into the Gulf. Okay, just open the taps and let them run. You know, so you have this, you know, this is an important secondary part. I mean, and the other way is to think about not merely during the fighting of war, but over flights. If you fly over the Mojave Desert, you can see tank tracks. What are the tank tracks from? War games from World War II. They're still there. The tank tracks from Patton's tanks running around the desert practicing are still there because that ecosystem is so fragile. And in the Gulf, you know, all throughout Western Iraq, will be decimated. And you may think, well, there's nothing there. It's just sand, so no big deal. No, in fact, there's a fragile ecosystem of plants and animals and stuff like that. We may not care about it, but we maybe should, because in fact, part of the ecosystemic issues, if you talk about biodiversity, the question on biodiversity is not how, I mean, or there's two aspects of biodiversity. One is, if you kind of think of it in two dimensions, what kind of biodiversity do we want? We want lots of different animals with lots of variation between them, right? And when you see all this stuff about biodiversity in the Amazonian basin, right, you have lots of different animals, right? They're all different species. But how much variation is there among those species? Not much. You know, it's the blue-bellied yellow sapsucker and the green-bellied yellow sapsucker, or whatever it is, right? You have very little variation between all the myriad ants that E.O. Wilson has identified as how many different kinds of species of ants there are. But each one of those very, very similar to each other, just enough different so they can't mate and have procreating progeny, right? So they are different species, as opposed to in desert ecosystems, for example, the differences between species is so huge, and certainly between those and what's happening in the Amazon, right? So that you also you may be equally concerned about that. So I think, so the first thing is just to make sure that you realize that the direction may move both ways, right? That environment causes harm to, I mean, may cause war, but war certainly causes harm to the environment. Okay? So let's walk through his argument. Okay, so he lays out three parts of the argument, right? The first is that we may have just a decrease in the quality and quantity of renewable resources, right? People, I mean, right, there's just less water, okay? For example, if you're, I mean, one of the ones kind of in the Lowy article, and just thinking about in Israel in general, all the water's been drained out of most of the aquifers, most of the Jordan River Basin, right? So you have much of the water is gone, right? Global warming is going to help that one, right? We're going to get warmer, get less water in those areas, probably more in other areas, but certainly less falling in certain desert areas. Desertification is going to happen, so you're going to have less and less water. And what water is there is going to be what? Well, what happens when you have I mean, just some of the biomechanics of it, right? You have, here's some land. Here's some nice waves hitting on the beach, right? Here's your aquifer, right? Your water basin, right? So you're pumping water up to irrigate your crops, to give water to your people. What happens? Salt water starts intruding, right? Because you basically got a vacuum here, right? As you pull this water up and move it somewhere else, you've got a vacuum where you get salt water intrusion. So all of a sudden your water is getting more and more saline. So the quality is going down. Not only do you have less of it, but what you do have is all briny, right? Is all mixed in with salt. So you now, you can kind of watch this happen, right? So you now have to have a little factory here that boils this off to get out the saline, right? To get out the salt so that it's potable. So which is then, of course you'll use fossil fuel for this, which only makes, the whole problem worse, right? It's hotter, so you need more water. And two, the water is becoming less and less available, so this problem kind of just multiplies over time. So, and you can think of this in any of numerous other resources, right? But the quality and quantity of renewable resources is going down, right? What's happening to the quality and quantity of non-renewable resources? Going down even faster, right? Or I don't know about quality, but certainly the quantity, we're hitting zero in terms of oil, in terms of any of the other non-renewables, right? Second, population growth. So there's less stuff, right? More people, right? So right now we just hit 6 billion a few months ago, right? We're on our way to 9 and then 12 soon enough. By 2050, I think we're supposed to be up at around 12 billion people, so double the number of people, and all of you are going to have kids. But of course, your kids will be environmentalists, so it's okay. But so there's going to be more people. So you basically take, what would it be? This divided by this, right? This one's getting small. Your numerator is getting smaller. Your denominator is getting larger. That the resources per person is getting smaller at a very fast rate. And what's the third part then? What's the third part that Homer Dixon talks about? That directly relates to that fraction of resources per person.
Some people will get more than others.
That my fraction is going to be just quite fine because I'm a white American male and I can take whatever damn resources I need, right? And I will leave the rest of the world with a much smaller fraction, right? So my fraction is going to stay the same. Right? In fact, hey, if the NASDAQ hadn't gone into the tank back a year ago, my fraction would be even better, right? So that my fraction of the world's resource is going to continue growing. I think sort of rough order of magnitudes, American fractions is 100 times the fraction for other people, just as a starting assumption, somewhere between 20 to 100 times, if you look at these fractions, so that we use a lot more resources per capita than people in the developing world. And if you've traveled, you probably don't frame it in those terms, but you see how poor these people are. And then think of what you have. That the resources you used to get over there and spent while you were there is probably a lifetime's resources for a lot of the people that you saw when you walked through the streets of some developing country city. So the third part is unequal resource access, right? Is that I have access to lots of resources. I can get on a plane tomorrow morning, fly to Chicago, go to a conference, hobnob with a bunch of international relations people who talk about international environmental politics, and then we all fly back home, having expended huge amount of resources, polluting the world in all sorts of ways, right? So we have unequal access, and we in America have more equal access, right? We're top dog, right? We have access to a lot of different resources. So that all computes to this increasing scarcity of renewable resources, right? And that scarcity is distributed differently around the world. Where it's more scarce and where it's less scarce depends a lot on this access issue, right? Okay, so So we reduce the quantity or quality of resources faster than we naturally replenish them. So topsoil, water, forests, species, wetlands, whatever, right? All of those things we take out faster than the world can replenish them. We kill whales faster than the recruitment rate. We get rid of different animals, all the different resources we use, topsoils, etc., at a much faster rate. We have people propagating it at rates that are, even if they're still not going up, we still have positive growth rates in most of the world. And countries that have negative growth rates now are instituting policies that will improve that, right? So countries like France that actually have a negative growth rate, right, that their population getting smaller year by year, particularly the native fraction, right, that is the non-immigrant fraction, has a negative population growth rate. And yet we got to fix that, right? Well, depends on what your perspective is. And what we do, we have people keep talking about a redistribution of wealth. We've got a redistribution of wealth going on in the world. It's just in the wrong direction, right? We've got a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the wealthy that continues to get exacerbated more and more. There's a thing, if you're interested in it, called the Gini Index. I don't even know what it stands for. Any economists in the group know what it stands for? I don't know what, it's some set acronym.
Gross inequity national indicator.
Gross inequity national indicator. Thank you, Malika. So it's basically, for each country, you know, I don't even know how it's computed, but it's something like what the top 1% have relative to the rest of the other 99, or the top 10% relative to 20, okay, the top 20 to the bottom 20, comparing those two. So, you know, this kind of measure of inequity, and if you did it on a global level, would be getting worse and worse, right? I mean, if you, I could bring in, Kari remembers from last term, a couple other, well, yeah, there's a champagne glass effect like this, which must, yes, right. This is the amount of resources that the top fifth have, and this is the amount of resources that the bottom fifth have. That if you look at the resources, the resource distribution, and then just, I mean, there's sort of all kinds of figures that'll depress the hell out of you if you look at how inequitably resources are distributed. So you have this increased scarcity of renewable resources. How does that lead to war? Because that's what, he doesn't call it war, he calls it acute conflict generally. But how does that lead to war? So what's the story? And this is an important part too, that I think I want to push you on in your final papers, and that I saw in some of the papers that you handed in last week. This thing of, some of you did it well and some of you did it not so well. This notion of telling causal stories, telling a narrative by which we understand why this treaty was effective. So that when we can say that, well, there was this treaty that said don't whale, and then we see not, you know, compliance with it. But you got to tell me how that happened. What was the relationship that led from this piece of paper being signed to these people changing their behavior? You have to tell that causal narrative. So what's the causal narrative here? So we have out here basically wars, right? I mean, acute conflict of various sorts. What's the story here? And you can tell it from based on this or what you read. What's the story where you get? It's one of the things that people tend to do is they tend to sort of get rid of these four middle polygons, right? And say, well, look, we've got these things going on, and we got lots of war. That's a correlational story. This is more of a causal story, trying to tell how does it happen. Well, these things lead to that, right? Increased scarcity, and then what?
Well, he says that the poor ethnic groups would migrate to a more resource-sufficient area.
Speak up a little bit.
Poor ethnic groups would migrate to a more resource-full area, and then that would cause ethnic conflicts.
Okay, so one is this migration. So what's the story there, Jennifer?
What's the story there?
Yeah, give me an example, either of a real life one or one you can think up. So tell me, like, start from some decrease in the quality or quantity of resources, and then walk me through how we get to me fighting with someone who I decide doesn't look like me.
Okay, well, in China, if parts of the river dry up, then different village groups would locate to a region that's closer to a more sufficient amount of water, and then that would cause conflicts between different rural villages.
Okay, great. So yeah, so you have the river dries up, right? And we can imagine this happening in lots of ways. The river dries up, the trees vanish, right? We kill off all the trees, then we move because we've got to have enough fuel for our fire in our house, or we need water. So we move to another area where there's already, if there's a lot of good resources there, guess what tends to happen when there's a lot of good resources in an area? People tend to be there already. So we're already horning in on their piece of the resources, right? So what they realize is that, go back to that fraction of, the resources to me fraction, right? My resources fraction. If somebody else comes in, it starts going down, right? This is the kind of the worst form of the racist version about why people in California worry about people coming over from Mexico and Latin America, right? That sort of, they're going to take my job, right? It's not, we have so many resources here, we don't need to worry yet about whether they're going to take our water or our wheat or, the other things we need to survive, or our electricity. Jesus. They might take our electricity, they get on the grid, and next thing you know, I can't get my VCR and my TV playing at the same time, right? So we worry about this sort of, this resources to me fraction, okay? So one is this thing where, so then we have a fight, and I just say, hey, look, you're turfing me, you're taking too much of my stuff, and I figure out some way to distinguish you from me, right? Either your language or your facial structure or your body type or what, all the ethnic bases we have for discriminating against people. And if you look around the world, you can find that it's pretty damn small, right? I can find lots of good reasons to be, if it gets down to it, we'll find ways that, we can discriminate against Eli because he's got blonde hair, or he can discriminate against me because I'm bald. Right? I mean, we can see all the similarities between Eli and me, and yet we'll find ways to distinguish between each other and go to war about it if we're creative that way as humans. Okay, so one is this kind of this version of resource, the destruction of resources leads to ethnic conflict. What's some of the rest? What are the other stories that Homer Dixon tells? And he has a whole book out now that's on these, and that tells very specific stories about different countries, okay? About how this happens. But what are some of the other ways we might expect the environmental problem to lead not merely to the destruction of the earth, but before we get there, to us killing each other on the way out?
He also argues that increased scarcity of renewable resources leads to decreased economic productivity, which means that families have lower incomes and the government revenue decreases, so that when family incomes decrease, they can no longer buy the food they need, but at the same time the government can't turn around and support them and help them in providing that food because their revenue is increased as well. And then people just get to a point where they're in such desperation that they act out in violence. Okay,
so that you then have internal violence, you have an overthrow of a government, coup d'etat, whatever, right? Okay, the people are just so fed up with the fact that the environment's going to hell in a handbasket, we can't survive, and the government's not providing for us, then we overthrow the government and get a government who can do it. Okay, fair enough? So this is this kind of, this decreased economic productivity to weaken states, to a coup, okay? Do you kind of find that convincing? Good? Yeah, okay.
In the case of Brazil, I can see it happening.
You could? Why?
Well, they already have that problem with, they have a big group called MST. It's just a movement of people that don't have access to land. Okay. And they've already started a lot of violent outbreaks in certain parts of the country. And they're getting increased support, through the media and stuff by other groups who aren't, a part of that rule of society. The other groups are starting to support them now. Okay. So as long as they continue to not get support, they're gaining ground and they're reacting with violence.
Okay. So that one of the resources they have is the anger of the people who are not getting fed by their government or whatever. Okay, fair enough. So you have a process in which people are really already, those processes are kind of in train, and they haven't led, we might already see, we certainly see this already, we might argue that there's a causal, that we can begin to see the weakening of the Brazilian state, whether it leads to a coup or just ethnic conflict within the state, you know, or deprivation conflicts, that's another question. But so you can start seeing sort of those things playing out. Any other kind of stories here?
You might have
Emily.
a conflict between two countries, say if a river is running between both of them, and one's upstream and one's downstream, and the upstream country decides to, you know, create a power plant on the river and decreases the amount of flow that's flowing to the downstream country, or decreases the water quality of that river, then you can have a conflict.
Okay.
That might, you know, if something doesn't get resolved, there might be open war between the two countries. And that's a really extreme situation. I know, like, Atlanta's getting charged something like $20,000 a day for polluting the Chattahoochee River.
Atlanta is getting charged.
I mean, there's like, you know, all the downstream communities are really upset.
Okay, so that the cities downstream have gone to court and forced Atlanta to pay up? Huh. And what are they getting exchange? Are they getting money, or are they getting some other water? I mean,
they're getting money, but I don't think Atlanta's really actually paying $20,000. They say they're being charged that, but I don't know the whole. I don't know.
Well, being charged and paying is always a different thing. I get charged my monthly rent, but I don't necessarily pay it. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Where's a real case of that? And then the question is why don't we see war? Where's a real case where we basically turned off the tap on a river? Eli?
Colorado?
Colorado. Right? I mean, basically all the wetlands that were the headwaters of the Gulf of Mexico, right? I mean, not the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of California, right? Wasn't that all fed by Colorado River water originally? Just dry. Okay. But so why don't we see a war there?
Mexico doesn't have enough power to sort of attack the U.S.
Go back to basic IR, right? That you only start wars that you think you have some prospect of winning, as long as the upstream state is more powerful. We don't have to worry about these problems, right? But you do. I mean, and one of the interesting questions is also how. I mean, you think in certain ways. I was surprised that during the Gulf War we didn't pressure Turkey to cut off the tap on Iraq, right? Turkey is upstream on several rivers from Iraq and has dams that it could have backed up, you know, and not necessarily completely, but could have certainly slowed the amount of water going into Iraq, and it was never used. I mean, which interesting. I've never seen a story about whether that was a moral choice or just a strategic choice or what, but interesting notions about why we didn't use that as as a tool of war. Okay. So you have these relationships, and you have a lot of, I mean, and one of just an interesting place, and my apologies to those who, I know these are heartfelt emotions for a lot of people, but it's certainly, if you just look at the process involved here in the Middle East, the relationships between the Palestinians and Israelis, and I know people have strongly held views about the relationships between the Palestinians and Israelis, but if you look at how water is used in that area, okay, and the deprivation of water to Palestinians who live in Israel, to look at kinds of at least the potential for conflict just around the water itself. Forget all the other violations that go on. The water itself serves as a huge source of difficulty for people in Palestine and in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And that the domestic laws allow that distribution to be so that actually Israeli Arabs get about a quarter of the water, have rights to about a quarter of the water per person that Israeli Jews have. And so that as that aquifer starts to dry up more, it's only going to get worse, right? And the sources of conflict are only going to get exacerbated. And so then what do you make of this this last part that I don't know if it was in this reading that you did, but certainly in some of his others, she said, before we discuss this is Homer Dixon, before we discuss the findings, it's important to note that the environment is but one variable in a series of political, economic, and social factors that can bring about turmoil. What does that mean? saying, okay, he just laid out this whole book. I mean, not only a book, but this is like several projects. He's gone down and advised the CIA, DOD. You know, he's generating millions of dollars worth of research money out of this research project. And he said, these things cause that. So what's the big set of circles that are left out here? Diana.
Okay.
Is this the whole story up here? Eli.
I feel like just by putting that in, he sort of goes against this whole argument. It's like, yeah, the environment causes war, but there's also all these other things out there that cause war that I'm not dealing with.
There's this whole thing called, you know, up here there's a little box that goes into ethnic conflict that's called people being jerks, right? You know, that's what mainly leads to, you know, and if you look at the variation in ethnic conflicts due to people being jerks versus all this other stuff, you say, well, people being jerks is like 98% responsible for ethnic conflicts, right? And then 2% is all this environmental garbage that Homer Dixon talks about, right? You know, et cetera. Coup d'etat is because, you know, of some institutional variables about the role of the military in these countries over, you know, decades or scores of years, you know, due to whatever, right? There's all these things, culture, institutions, you know, human nature, if you want. All these other things, all the other things that you learned in basic IR about why war happens, right? When you go through why does war happen, it's not like environment's top of your list here, right? It's all this other stuff, you know, power, interests, you know, human nature, all these things, right? The structure of anarchy, tragedy of the commons, all that stuff. Those are the things that cause conflict, not something about resources, okay? So, I mean, do you buy that, or do you think I'm wrong? Or kind of, how do you respond to that? Diana?
I think maybe one aspect of it that the idea that I got was that, you know, maybe the environment and scarcity of resources isn't, you know, wholly responsible. I mean, I wouldn't buy that in the first place, but you know, as a catalyst, I think that's, you know, I mean, that perfectly can fulfill that role. I mean, if there's tension to start with, and then you add something, you know, so fraught with conflict anyway as environmental scarcity, most likely you're going to end up with some kind of violent conflict. I mean, I think as a catalyst, that's a distinct possibility.
Okay, so if you think the Intifada's bad now, wait till 5 years from now when those, you know, all the Palestinians are parched dry. Okay, so one thing is that it may be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? It's just we have this environmental stuff on top of everything else, and it's the thing that makes it happen. It's the catalyst. Okay. Look, Kari.
Isn't also in the environment something where you can sort of apply precautionary principles? While it's like it's a little bit harder to set up a organized, you know, against somebody being a jerk at one point versus having an environmental problem and organizing things beforehand so it won't ever happen.
Okay. So an important thing when we're looking at variables is sometimes the part we can manipulate is really small. But it's the part we can manipulate, right? That is, there may be really important, in other words, we may believe, like let's take the basic thing about nature versus nurture in raising a child, right? We may believe that nature is 95% of it. Does that mean we don't worry about nurture? No, because nature is 95% of it, but the only 5% we can control is the nurture part, is to hope that given what we can do with that 5%, which is the nurture part, that's where we have the leverage, right? That's where our policy leverage is. So it may be important, not because it's an important cause of it, but because it's the only cause we can manipulate, right? We don't know how to control war by controlling people being jerks, so we control it by controlling resources. Megan?
I think it's also not quite that simple, because there's a lot of things in society that are also the result of lack of resources.
That are also what?
The results of lack of resources. If you talk about institutional setups that allow military governments to gain control, a lot of times that has to do with resources and how they're distributed in society, and the fact that, you know, there's a huge gap between have and have-nots, that allows the military to gain more power.
Okay.
So I think that there just need to be more lines and more boxes.
Okay, so one is this is an incomplete picture. Okay, and so that there may be other really important aspects that are kind of back here, feeding. I mean, there's certainly some feeding this, right? Like our morals about the fact that you can't have, that we all get down on China for their one-child policy, but that's the only country in the world that's actually attacking this problem in a significant way, right? You know, but we also have a bunch of institutions that are causing this, right? And sure as hell a lot of institutional arrangements that are the source of this problem. And so those are things that we can manipulate. And these are merely the outcomes of other things that are further back that are also, in a sense that if you have sort of institutions that cause inequity out here, it has a causal arrow that goes to unequal resource access, but it has a causal arrow that goes directly to coup d'etat and ethnic conflicts too. You know, it doesn't have to go through this resource conflict, right? So there's some deeper seated things that you want to be concerned about as well. Eli.
I'm wondering, is this just not sort of like a subset of, like, I guess, power struggle theory? Like, it just seems like a lot of these conflicts, yeah, they're revolving around, like, resources, but it's really the main point of it is, like, people trying to get more power than the other person. Okay. So doesn't this look like war the way we learned it in PS35, right? Yeah, sure. Okay, just a special variant. Okay, well, yeah, and I mean, to be cynical about it, here was Tad Homer Dixon saying, I mean, you know, this is not how it happened, but you sort of say, how do I get, in the 1990s, how do I get money out of the MacArthur Foundation, right, that says, you know, that allows me to do research I want to do? Well, I have to reframe things that have been traditionally framed as war and put an environmental spin on them, right? You know, so that one can say, okay, wait, this is just the old stuff in the old theory in new packages, right? People buy that? Kim.
Even with that, another important point that one of the readings brought out is that environmental cause conflicts are a lot easier to deal with from a prevention standpoint than they are after the fact, you know, and trying to go back and intervene.
Okay.
It's a lot more effective if you understand how this causal relationship was beforehand and can therefore stop it before it gets to a certain point. Then try to go back after and say, oh yeah, we know what happened, now let's do this. Because at that point the resources are gone and the people have already, you know, acted out.
Okay. Okay. People buy that it's easier to fix these problems beforehand? Prevention is worth a pound of cure? An ounce of prevention maybe, I mean, again, just to kind of push it the other way, an ounce of prevention may be worth a pound of cure, but we can't afford the ounce of prevention, right? That is, yes, it makes a hell of a lot of sense to do that, and we just refuse to do so, right? There's lots of things we should be doing. We should be, you know, we should have been working the Middle East problem 40 years ago, right? But no, we just let it kind of fester and fester and fester until we have wars every few years, you know, to deal with it, rather than kind of addressing the deep-seated ethnic conflict that underscores that, and sort of going in and saying, we're going to spend money from the UN to teach Palestinian and Israeli Jewish children how to get along together so that when they grow up to be 50 years old, they don't actually start bombing each other again, right? So that the fact that we should do it and that it makes sense to do it doesn't mean we do it. So that just a kind of word of caution. Miranda, did you have a point earlier?
Yeah, I was going to say that I agreed with the whole causal thing from scarcity to decreased economic production. But then after reading, I think, one of the later essays, it made much more sense that causal link was kind of weak, like that from going from having no resources, all of a sudden, like, the nation's not as productive. Mm-hmm. I think one of the authors make the point, like, you know, world trade is at a point where no country is completely dependent upon exactly what their resources are. Like, she made a good case for Japan, mm-hmm. where, you know, their GNP is one of the highest, but their natural resources are probably one of the lowest of any other countries.
Okay. So that these linkages, they all, I mean, here we got them all with all the lines are equal between these boxes, right? And in some sense, some of these lines may be very thin, and other lines, especially the lines from things that we haven't described on this graph, may be much thicker, right? So ingenuity, okay? I mean, and Tad's current project, I mean, just came out with another book called The Ingenuity Gap. Very interesting argument in which he's arguing, here's kind of the problem, and the real problem is not any of this stuff. The problem is our inability you know, if we have a list of here are the demands of the problems we face, the real problem is our kind of the supply of solutions is so limited, and our ability to supply solutions both individually and institutionally is very limited, and that's where the real problems arise. So, you know, so he's done a really interesting research project here, and now he's saying, but the real source of the problem is that we can kind of see what Kim's saying. We should do this. This would be good, and yet our ability to devise institutions, ideas, solutions is very limited. So he's just finished another book just a couple months ago on this subject of how do we solve this ingenuity gap, between the problems we face and our solutions to them. So what do people? Finishing that part, then. So what do people think of Dewdney's argument? Right? What is Dewdney's argument for starters? Right? I mean, you had to read him, right? The piece in here, right? So what's the core of his argument? He buys Homer-Dixon? Or which of them which do you buy? Do you believe Homer-Dixon, or do you believe Dan Dewdney? Yeah, Sarah.
Can't they exist together?
Okay, how?
Well, I mean, if one's saying war causes environmental problems, and the other's saying environmental problems cause war.
Well, is that what Dewdney's argument? I mean, those two can coexist, certainly, but I don't think that's the argument that Dewdney's making, right? Dewdney's not making a war causes environmental degradation. That's part of it, I mean, but I don't think the core of his argument, right? So let's get Dewdney's argument on the table then. What's Dewdney's argument look like? Anybody? Oh, that's right. It was a 3-day weekend. I forgot. Miranda.
Well, he doesn't want to consider environmental resources like a security problem. And if anything, he says that there's not really a lot of links between like resource distribution and conflict.
Okay. Okay, so he, one, questions empirically, is Homer-Dixon right? He just says, hey, great theory, the facts don't support you, right? That's sort of step one, is just say, hey, you're wrong empirically. But then I think the more interesting part of his argument is the second part. So kind of develop that more, Miranda. This part about that, you know, it's not a good approach. I mean, basically he says, not only are you wrong empirically, but normatively, this really sucks, right? This is the wrong way to go. Why is it the wrong way to go? What's Dewdney's argument about? Even if it were right, if it were true, it would be bad politically to push this agenda. Why is it bad politically?
Well, one thing he says is that if you push this idea of national security, then you foster nationalism, which leads to discrimination of all these other different, states or minorities.
Okay. So one of them is sort of exacerbating the ethnic conflict part, right? If you really want to help make ethnic conflict worse, make people think about us versus them. And what's the arena we most think about us versus them? Security, right? And so if we frame things, so this is the kind of the politics of framing, right? If we frame things as it's a security threat, what do? I lock my doors. You know, I buy a gun. That's how I respond to security threats, right? Ashley.
Another thing is if you frame it in terms of a security threat, and then you get nationalism in terms of like you're more concerned with yourself and your people, and to deal with environmental problems you need more of global solutions because it's not like it just affects you and your country and that there's like clear-cut boundaries.
Right. Okay, so that what we really need is this notion of going back to not getting the resources over me, but getting the resources over us and us as a global citizen, right? I mean, and indeed go back to the kind of deep ecology stuff we talked early on about. It's resources over us, where us is everything, with it's all the animals and plants and people, and kind of this broader notion of self-interest, right? To expand our notions of self-interest, our notions of who we care about and how we want resources distributed, and this notion of that if we fall back into the security framing we've had, then who cares about the Russians going under? Who cares about these people who live in countries that most Americans don't know where they are, let alone how to pronounce them, right? We don't worry about those things because those are other people. They ain't us. But, go back to the pogo thing about, we've met the enemy and he is us, right? This notion that, hey, environmental problems, the solution to environmental problems is us doing things, right? It's not, the big corporation out there. It's not PG&E. PG&E is not the problem. It's having the lights on. PG&E is just a supplier, right? Right? It's not the drug dealer, it's the person who uses the drug that's the problem, right? The drug dealer is just providing, right? So those are, kind of, I think, so it's an important part of it is just it creates this nationalism, right? And exacerbates that and kind of allows us, here's a great opportunity at the end of the Cold War to break out of that nationalism, and yet we don't, right? And rather, in fact, we reinforce it. So that's part of the argument. Sarah.
Sort of commenting on the point that I'm just wondering how Disney would react to the situation of water, two countries fighting over water. One has it, one gets it, the other one doesn't, because it pushes them down. I mean, how does that fall into his, environmental problems don't attack one state, even though the scarcity of water problem is harming one state and not the other? I mean, what would he say?
Okay.
How does that discount? How could he discount that scarcity thing, Homer Dixon?
Okay, so anybody have an answer? Or help start thinking it through? Because the question is so we actually do see wars where there's war over water. Okay, and how can you say that? And it's a war because the amount of water is less than it used to be. That was initiated. So then how can we fail to see that as an environmental problem?
Well, I guess if you put it that way, I guess he could say, oh well, there's other things that contributed to their conflict. It wasn't just that. But isn't that still sort of an environmental problem that posed a threat to one country?
Okay. Megan?
It's probable that they're both very good pundits, and they've taken very extreme opposite views, but probably they're both a little true. I mean, Dick is saying, one of them is saying that the only thing that causes ethnic conflict is environmental resource, and the other one is saying that environmental resources never cause ethnic conflict. It's not that simple. Obviously, sometimes ethnic conflicts are caused by, or helped by, or prevented by, or any of the above.
Okay, so
I think they're just both oversimplified.
Right. So that's how you get ahead in academically, right? Is you lay out a bright line and you say anybody who crosses this is is a pagan who doesn't believe in the one true path, sort of, right? So that you make really hard lines theoretically, partly because it forces you to think clearly, right? So that at least we know what it would look like at the extreme, right? To know what it would look like if the world was dominated by environmental problems causing conflict, and then we can say. Then we can start engaging the debate about how often is that true, and more importantly, and I think a really important insight of Homer Dixon's work is not that, in some ways, he's not so susceptible to the argument that it's not empirically true. Why isn't Homer Dixon susceptible to the argument that his claim about environmental scarcity causing war is not true? Why is he not so susceptible to that?
Because it's increasing.
Because it hasn't been true yet, but it's about to be true, right? I mean, to say, hey, we haven't gotten to that level of environmental degradation yet that it's really kind of presenting itself, or expressing itself in terms of conflict. But it will. Trust me, it will. And there's not. I mean, one should be tempted when people say tomorrow's going to look a lot different than it does today. In general, on average, we should expect the world to look a lot like. Tomorrow to look a lot like the way it does today. But in this case, you can say we got a trend line here that's heading in a certain direction, and 20 years from now, the world is going to look worse. We're not going to have glaciers, right? I mean, when you read this article on glaciers in the New York Times, it says, hey, the water is not going to be there for people downstream. And those people will have to move. And they will move into a valley, the next valley over, which also doesn't have water, and all of them will troop together over to all the way to the other side of the mountain where the Amazon is still flowing a little bit, and they'll go have wars with whoever's over in that valley, right? So you can see, okay, we may not be there yet, But soon enough, people are going to come in and want our SUVs, right? I mean, that kind of dynamic is going to happen. So that one can say, yeah, maybe it wasn't true, but it's certainly likely to be true in the future. And so that's, I think, an important element, a kind of argument to say, no, it's not true, but it will be. And then you can say, well, what are the indicators that it's getting worse, and should we begin to see some of these conflicts playing out? But I think, for me at least, the more telling part is then so one is this kind of what are the moral implications of it. So the first is to say, well, to think of it as a security issue is the wrong framing because it gets us thinking nationalistically. But the other part is, what's the other element of a security issue? Or what are some of the other elements of a security? Miranda.
Thinking of it as a security issue, it puts it in this frame of mind where it's important. Like each nation needs to think about it like it is a threat. Like I think it brings about like an urgency. Like the same way that you would think about war and people invading your territory. Like it brings that same kind of like threshold. Like we need to deal with this now. There's a problem that's imminent, and it puts that kind of feeling on it.
Is that a good thing?
Yeah, I think that is an effective way to think about it. That would tend to like get people moving, get policymakers treating it like it is something that is like a present threat and not just long range.
Right. So the plus side of thinking of it as a security issue is, hey, get on the agenda, right? I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about before. $300 billion sitting out there waiting to be used by the Defense Department. Give us a piece of that, right? Say that this is how the Defense Department should be spending its money. So that, the money that's being spent for, Sherry Wasserman Goodman as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Environmental Protection is out there. Hey, that's an X billion dollars that's helping to prevent military bases from polluting the environment. This is a good thing, And if we can't get people to worry about ethnic conflict for any other reason, but if we can get them to worry about it because it's an environmental problem, right? If we can get the Defense Department to go in and start protecting places environmentally because they think it'll lead to war later, so it's an investment for them, great. Who cares if it's true? As long as we can get them to do it, as long as we can get them to think like it's true, that's a plus. So that's kind of on the other side. That's on the contrary to Dewdney's side. That's on Tad Homer side of the Tad Homer Dixon's side of the equation, right? Is a sense of, hey, the plus side is, who cares if it's true? I mean, and Tad really believes it, and I think there's an important there. I think Megan hit it on the head, which is that there are important truths here, and it ain't the whole story, and that it's some combination. But to say, okay, on that side, then good to increase the urgency of it. If we can't get people, we don't seem to be able to get people's attention about the environmental problems any other way. If you got to lie to them and tell them it's a security problem, let's go with that. Okay. What's the counter to that Dewdney makes then?
Some issues get more attention and urgency than they really deserve.
Okay. So one is we worry about water when we should be worried about species loss or whatever, right? In other words, that we only worry about the ones that might lead to conflict.
Climate change and food security is a more pressing issue.
Okay. Right. So that we have lots of food security issues right now, and we're not worried too much about them because they happen to people who don't happen to look like us, right? Okay. Megan?
That's not really the problem. That's not where we want the resources.
Meaning what?
Meaning, yes, we have to make a decision whether we want, if there is no causal link between ethnic conflict and environmental degradation. Okay. We do have to make a choice about where we want to put resources in dealing with both of those. But we don't want to put it all into environment if there is something else causing ethnic conflict that we should also be working on.
Okay. So one is, to the extent we're taking money away from peacekeeping missions or training in alternative dispute resolution and putting it towards environmental problems, we may solve the environmental problem, but we've killed ourselves all off because we haven't figured out how to work ADR.
The other reasons for that ethnic conflict are still...
Okay, right. So the other 98% of the cause of the ethnic conflict problems are still there. Okay. I mean, I think another important element of it is that if environmental problems, or knowing what we know about environmental problems, what kind of solution do we want? And does it look like the way we structure our solutions to security problems? That is an extremely hierarchical, in other words, if you think about what is our solution to security problems, it's called the military. It involves a process of training young men and women to to be completely replaceable, right? To be completely replaceable parts in a system which allows them to, kill other humans without not thinking about it, right? I mean, this whole process, if you wanted to go to the extreme, but it's also extremely hierarchical. Devolves all decision making up to the top. Has very little information flow up and down the chain in terms of what's happening on the ground because decisions are being made at the top and pushed down, right? Is that the kind of decision making we need on environmental problems? Or do we need a distributed sort of decision making? I mean, that's a big part of Dooney's argument, right? We need to distribute decision making where people know, hey, this is what's happening in my environment. This is the identity politics of Tesh and Williams, right? I know what's happening to me, and I know how to stop it, right? I know that I'm getting cancer from this waste dump that's upstream from me, and I know how to stop it, and I'm going to mobilize my people in a very flat sort of organizational structure in which we all listen to each other, right? We don't have this hierarchy, and that's the hierarchy is part of the problem, that information and decisions are not being made at the same level. That people who know what's going on the ground are not given power to make decisions. Well, that's exactly the wrong kind of problem, the wrong kind of solution. Megan.
Well, I think one of the things with the environment is that so many of those issues are very fundamental to people's lives, like how much water they're getting to cook with, that if you try and dictate to them from a higher level, just arbitrarily, no, you can't use that much water, no, you can't have that much water, you're going to end up with more conflict in terms of more, disagreement with the state, more sort of civil conflict. Then if you explain to them, look, this is how much we have, and we're going to try and divide it up, and it doesn't work hierarchically at all.
Okay. So doesn't seem like the right approach to you to the solution. Given the shape of the problem, this is not a solution. That military may be a really good solution to military kind of security threats, right? That is, you do want concentrated decision making. You don't want people deciding on the ground whether to fight one guy or not, right? But for environmental problems, that you want a more distributed decision making process that gets information and decisions being made at the right level, okay? And that equally important, that involves people in that process where they're not being told what to do. They're involved in the process of owning it, right? Of saying, hey, this is my problem, and this is my Earth, and I've got to protect my fraction of it. Not for myself, not from others, but for others, right? I mean, I think that's probably the big distinction, is that the nationalism says I protect myself from others, and in a kind of an environmental mentality would be I protect it for others. This broader sense of self. So, I think that's. I mean, where do people? Where do people come down on this? Where do people kind of? I mean, should this be which side do people buy? Do people buy? And let's say if you were funding, say you're working for the Hewlett Foundation or the Packard Foundation now, right? You're a grants officer, and you've got to decide whether to fund Dewdney or Homer Dixon, right? Who do you fund? And the easy answer is saying, well, some of both, right? I mean, you give them both $1 million, doesn't cut it, okay? So you have to make a choice. Who do you fund, and why? Should this environment cause security problems, cause acute conflict? Should that research program be continued? Lots of research. I'm sure there's a lot of PhDs being written on it right now, going out and getting funding to go do research in Africa to show how in Ghana or whatever, or in Nigeria, that here are these environmental conflicts that are or environmental problems that are going to directly lead to acute conflict. And that's how they're getting money, because you get people's attention if you say you're going to kill other people, right? I mean, to me, the saddest part of this whole thing is, this is a whole thing about that says, concern about the environment by itself is not enough. It has to, and it's not even when it harms, this is sort of the shallowest of ecologies, right? At the deep end of ecologies, we care about it because the environment's getting worse, and who cares what happens to humans? Shallow ecology is we care about it if kind of it might have some impacts on humans at some point. This is like, kind of just a little bit of water covering the, I mean, it's not even shallow. It's, like dry land here in terms of, we care about it because humans are going to be killed by other humans due to environmental problems. That's the only reason we care about the environment. This worries me if we can't get people concerned about the environment for other reasons, only when it has the implication that somebody might shoot somebody else. This should worry you a little bit about what we have to do to get people's attention as the globe, gets flushed down the toilet here, right? I mean, that if this is the only way we can get people's attention, this certainly scares me, right? Miranda.
Is there a way to include the middle ground, or like the redefining of security in terms of like human security? Like, I liked actually that saying the middle of that.
You liked what?
I liked, who is this? I don't know who this is that wrote about human security. And I like the fact that it still has a security aspect to it, like there is a threat, but instead of saying, we're going to deal directly with like national security, and you tend to just think like war and violence, like think about it like the security of just like basic human needs. And a lot of the causes, like you can still link back to the fact that, there's a scarcity of resources. Basically, there's a group of people whose needs aren't being met in the first place. And if you want to link that to the environment or, economic security, like, I thought that was a really good way to frame it.
And there's an extensive literature, a lot of the feminist literature in international relations theory is sort of that reframing of security as, wait, you've been all this time worried about this, national security, right? This notion of, but if you look at when is a woman's security at risk, it's equally at risk whether people are at war or not. And in fact, it may be more, the more my country is if I'm a woman, right, the more my country is at war, the more at risk I may be, because the more likely the men I'm interacting with come back from war being violent, right? So I'm more likely to be battered or raped, if I live in a country which is at war than if I live in a country that's not. So kind of to reframe security is not about the security of the nation state, because in terms of my individual security, I'm worse off when my country is being defended, and militarized and hierarchized, but rather I'm safer if we reframe security as, let's provide for all the individual security in our country rather than for American security. Let's provide for Americans' security. And that's a different framing, but that requires a very deep kind of ideological shift in in how we define security. So in some ways this kind of pushes duty back and says, yeah, if you want to buy into the fact that this social construction of what nationalism is, and what security is, can't change, fine, but it's a social construction. So we can rechange it. We can think about, we don't need to think about security as us versus them. We can think about security at the individual level, right? Or even at the ecosystemic level, right? I mean, we could reframe to say, how do we provide for environmental security that gets rid of the baggage of the traditional rhetorical baggage of what security means, and reframe it in those ways. Okay, good. Other views on this kind of debate about whether, is this an important debate to have? What's the value of continuing this debate? Is it a valuable set of concepts for you in thinking about what the threats, what the environmental problem is? Sorry.
One of my sort of fears, or with the Homer-Dixon argument, was that it seems to me like environmental problems, there's so much about international cooperation that it's sort of coming back to the idea of like shutting doors, that making it into a security dilemma really is sort of opposing the basic way of solving environmental problems, like, or the basic fact that environmental problems cannot be solved by a single nation. Like, we're not one big nation in the globe, but it has to be solved by cooperation.
Okay, and that by setting up the security issue tends to move you farther away from that. So that if we start with the environmental problem where it's all our environment, and then we kind of start with a more cooperative frame. Okay. Maybe one last question to think about. Eli, did you want to get in?
Well, I just had one question. What I thought was interesting was the whole part about Japan and like how through trade you can sort of like limit the conflict of resource scarcity, and sort of where that fits in with a lot of the talk now about like free trade in the world and stuff like that.
What was your take?
I don't know. Like if you look at it just that way, I think maybe like free trade is a good thing because it can sort of like relieve a lot of the tension due to resource scarcity. Which,
for those who have money to buy, right?
Right.
I mean, I think one of the important issues is, notice it was an article, it was about Japan, not Belize or or Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria or whatever, right? I mean, you want to kind of look at this sort of distributional effects, right, and say free trade's, at least according to a lot of theorists, if free trade, doesn't float everybody's boat, right? Free trade only floats some boats, right? I mean, and then a lot depends on terms of trade and all of those different issues, so that this Gini index, this global Gini index, is getting worse. And and the question is it getting worse at a slower rate because of free trade or at a faster rate because of free trade? I mean, so we want to ask the same causal question there to say, and so I think it's worth asking is does free trade exacerbate or mitigate kind of the effect of resource scarcity and resource distributional problems, or does it help them, or does it just, because you can imagine it working both ways, right? I mean, if you think of their piles of goodies on each country's land, the question is what happens to the piles of goodies due to free trade? Do they go like this, or do they go like this? And kind of, if we think that equity matters, either because equity matters in and of itself, or because equity matters because of environmental scarcity, we want it to go like this. But certainly you could at least pick cases to prove the point that it went like this, right? And the question is what on average is it doing? Is it on average helping or not? Megan?
Doesn't productivity growth dictate that it goes like this?
Yeah.
The theory of productivity growth dictates that, yes.
I just don't know if it's quite that much of a zero-sum equation.
That's the right question, which is it a zero? Do they both go up? But the question might be, we also then, go back to notions of absolute versus relative gains in IR, right? Does it matter that that last year I had $500 per year? I had an income of $500. I'm in this poor country. Does it matter to me that I had $500 income last year and this year I have $1,000? Is that what's important to me, or is it that I was making a tenth of what this guy was making, of what the average person in my country was making last year, and now I'm making 100th of that? Is that fact more relevant, regardless of the fact that I'm still making twice as much as I used to? And I think probably people are such that both are important, right? I want to have a bigger salary than last year. I want to get a raise, and I want to get more of a raise than the other guy down the hall, right? And both of those are part of my psyche, right? I think the last thing to just think about, and I'll leave you with this. Let's imagine this environmental security linkage is wrong, right? Or at least very limited in its effect, right? It's not particularly important. It explains 2% of the variation in conflict. Then the question is, would it, and then take Miranda's point about that but it may be, spacing it now. Why is it valuable to make this argument? What was the argument you laid out, Miranda? Oh, so because it draws attention to the environmental issues. So what if it was empirically wrong? Thus, it's untrue. It's a lie to say that environment causes, environmental degradation and loss causes security problems. That's a lot. Let's imagine we found it. Undoubtedly that's not true, and there's some truth to it. But let's imagine it was fundamentally a lie, fundamentally wrong. Is it still moral to use that to get attention on environment? If we really believe that protecting the environment is worthwhile, and not even, I think this is what the argument Megan was making a little bit, which is, but if it's, or it's an implication of what she was making is that, well, if it's wrong, then you won't solve the problem. So, but still, you might get attention to in the environmental. You wouldn't solve the acute conflict problem, but you might solve the environment problem, which is all we care about. I'm a hardcore environmentalist. Who cares about people killing themselves? That's a good thing to take care of the population problem, right? But rather, I'm worried about solving the environment problem because I'm worried about the trees and the plants and the animals and all that stuff. And so therefore, if I can get attention on it, I don't care how I do it. Is that moral? Mark?
Yeah,
no.
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, that's what, look at, all the pro-democracy supporters that they're trying to convince everyone that democracy is good for stability and a nation will lead to less conflict, and they don't necessarily have overwhelming proof that that's true. A lot of it's sort of correlation or whatever, but they're still saying that democracies are good, and they could do the same thing about environmental protection, or trying to solve environmental problems. That, okay, maybe we can't totally prove it, but it's likely to have an impact on stability, if we can resolve some of it. Which is what I was, when you were talking about, people were talking about how security trying to link the security and the environment might not necessarily be good because it would bring up sort of nationalist issues. But if you look at something like NATO or what the EU is trying to develop, like a new security identity, if you bring in an environmental component, then it might lead to more cooperation. And granted, that's not going to be true for everyone in the world, but I think it might start working.
Okay. Okay. Sarah, very briefly. We're out of time, but.
Okay. I think it just seems more important to really look at environmental problems for what they are and what they're doing to society besides conflict, if that isn't true. And I think that there needs to be some sort of the other reasons that needs to be the reasons that it's put on the table, but that may involve like a value changing thing, like we need to be more concerned about the environment rather than security or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah,
I think that
the other reasons that to push the environmentalist idea. We don't need this, and if it comes out that this is untrue, then it might negate the whole environmentalist movement. So it seems really silly to push for something that if you know it's not true.
Okay. And that's the core question, though, and you'll see this in a lot of areas where, and why it seems to me, especially those of you, in Mark's case, Mark doesn't have to do empirical research because it doesn't matter to him whether it's true or not, right? But you guys have to know whether it's true before you push a certain line of argument, and I think that's where kind of get back about are these things true or not, and and even for Mark, it's an important aspect of knowing whether it's true or not.